Before we get started, I have a quick favor. I've been self-funding the Finding Genius podcast for 5 years now. I've done over 3,000 episodes. And as you can see on YouTube, we're up over 1 million views on the channel, which is fantastic. The next thing I really want to push on is to get up to 10,000 subscribers. Because once we do, we'll be able to put a donate button and we'll be able to solicit donations to help keep the podcast running and to also get the Finding Genius Foundation moving along. We have a big project studying anxiety, depression, and PTSD and working on a product to help people overcome these problems because I've seen them explode recently after the last 2 years of the whole virus situation. So if you would, please subscribe to the podcast. That would help us tremendously. Give us a thumbs up and check in the description for Buy Me a Coffee. It's about $5. If you could buy me a coffee, I'd really appreciate it. It would help keep the channel going, and I love coffee. Thank you.
Forget frequently asked questions.
Common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
Go above and beyond.
they become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%.
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
With Richard Jacobs.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius Podcast. I've got a returning guest. We had a great conversation last time. I expect the same. That's Andrew from YouTube. His channel is called Post-Apostolic Church. Today we're going to talk about the Septuagint, which is, again, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the history of it, and some of the nuances about it. So I think it promises to be a very interesting call. So welcome back, Andrew. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me back.
Yeah, and just for listeners that may not have listened last time, if you could just give a brief, your background and what led you to create your YouTube channel and populate it with all these great videos.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things is, as someone who grew up in Christianity, I had a lot of questions about what's truth, what's the Bible. And when I found the early Christians, and when I say that, I mean the Christians that lived right after the time of the apostles, I found that they had a lot of writings, and they really spoke to me. They answered a lot of my questions. They really had a good grasp on the Bible and the church because, again, they were the successors to the apostles. And so I made my YouTube channel to share some of their faith and history to the internet.
Okay. And the Septuagint, when did it first come across your radar? And, I'm sure you've done a lot of research on it yourself, which we'll talk about today. So, let's get into that story. Like, how did you first start thinking, I wonder how much more to it is there than maybe a snippet or two that you've heard about the Septuagint?
Right. When I first, 10 years ago, all I heard was the name, and I knew what it was. It was some kind of Greek writing. And the Septuagint is the Greek version of the Old Testament. And it was some 10 years ago, I just got this bug. Really, it was an obsession. And I thought, I have to figure out what this is. Sometimes people hear about some unknown thing and maybe they're scared of it and so they stay away or they don't care. But in this case, for some reason, I said, I have to learn what this thing is. And so I really dove into it for my personal reasons at first and find out what it was, when it was, how it came to be. And then when I quickly discovered that it was very related to the early Christians, I was able to take a lot of my research and post videos about the Septuagint on my channel. And so since then, it has been a very big passion of mine to talk about the Septuagint and what it is.
One quick question comes to mind. I wonder if there was a period shortly after a good amount, well, maybe after all the New Testament, the epistles, everything was written. I wonder if there was a call within the early church to say, we don't need the Old Testament. The covenant's new. That's not really applicable. Who cares? Just work with the current material we have since Jesus came. Was there ever any pressure for that?
None at all. Not at all. I mean, the early Christians, the apostles, they valued the Septuagint as scripture just as they valued Jesus himself. And because, again, for the apostles and the early Christians, they saw the Old Testament as pointing to Jesus, including the Septuagint, the Greek version of it. And so to them, the Septuagint was already ingrained in their culture because since most of them were Jews and they used the Septuagint, so they carried it into Christianity. And one of the things that Christians did was they pointed to the Septuagint and they said, see, Jesus is the Messiah. He is the Christ. Because look, Jesus fulfills all these things that the Septuagint talks about. And so that's really, in that way, they needed the Septuagint because that was their prophecy and proof that Jesus was the Christ. And so for the Christians, they loved it.
Besides the apostles, though, the regular run-of-the-mill Christians, were there any movements within Christianity that you know of that said, the Old Testament's not relevant, or was everyone respectful of it and everyone wanting to include it?
Everybody was. Not a single person I know of said the Old Testament meant nothing. Like you and I talked about in our last conversation, I think the group that probably disrespected the Old Testament the most, even though, again, they did not, was the Gnostics. Of course, I think when I say they disrespected it, it's because the Gnostics believed that the God of the Old Testament was an evil and wicked God and different from the God of the New Testament. But, you and I talked about that last time.
Okay. I just wanted to be clear. Yeah. I love the Old Testament, too. I think it's very important, so I'm not trying to say it's not. The idea came to mind, so I was just curious. That's all.
Right. Yeah. No, it's always been a valuable thing in Christianity. One of the things I want to share is, the first thing is how the Septuagint came to be. And
first of all, what time period are we looking at when it was written?
Okay, so the translation for it started around 250 BC. Okay, so I'd like to set the stage for 250 BC by saying this. And I think a lot of people, at least I think I would say this, I don't know if people would agree with me, but I think all good stories start with Alexander the Great. To me, he is so pivotal in history. So I want to mention a little bit about him. So he grew up and came out of Macedonia, which is northern Greece, and he conquered a huge portion of the world. And one of the things that made him so successful was his culture, because he took his language, his culture, and he placed his culture wherever he went. He didn't just conquer places, he conquered and brought the Greek culture. And one of the main things that he accomplished was the spread of his Greek language. So before Alexander the Great, you had what was classical Greek. And classical Greek would include how they wrote during the philosophers like Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle. Alexander the Great is right after them. And so when he went conquering, Alexander the Great brought a new form of Greek called Koine Greek. Koine meaning common. Now, this language was amazing. It was different from other languages for one reason. Koine Greek was the first language that had written vowels. To me, that is significant. And before his language...
And like in ancient Hebrew, you have to just figure it out what the vowels could be or would be.
Right. I think at the time of Alexander the Great, other languages had maybe vowel sound marks, like accent marks, things like this.
So like Hebrew today in the Nikudot, they have the marks, in Arabic too, when you first learn that, taking both, and you have the marks to help you know the vowel.
Right. And language since Koine Greek have adopted that practice of adding vowels to their language, to written language. They had it spoken, that's for sure, but to written language, others followed suit and added vowels. Now, I think that's what made Koine Greek extremely powerful and easy to learn, not only because it was the common Greek, it was easier to learn than classical, but it had the written vowels that people could really gravitate to, understand.
Okay. So was Koine Greek just what the common man spoke, or was it a constructed language? Like, what was it?
It was a constructed official language, but it was something that the common Greek spoke. And so it was easier to learn than other languages. And so when Alexander the Great went around, he brought his Koine Greek wherever he went. So fast forward not very long to Alexander's death, because as you may know, I think he died in his 20s. I could be wrong, maybe his 30s. But he was insanely successful in just a little amount of time. And when he died, he failed to appoint his successor. And so the world that he had conquered had split into 4 regions, and they were around the Mediterranean. And the one I want to focus on is one of his 4 generals that took over Egypt, because Alexander conquered Egypt, and the dynasty that ruled Egypt was called the Ptolemies. And the Ptolemies ruled Egypt after Alexander the Great. So again, think of it as Greek kings ruling Egypt. And it was during the Greek kings over Egypt that the Septuagint was written.
Did a particular king commission it, or who wanted it?
Yes, it was commissioned by Ptolemy II. Ptolemy II was very successful, and he's the one who said, I want to create the greatest library on earth, which is known as the Library of Alexandria.
Alexandria.
Okay. So he wanted a writing from all over the world, and he heard about the Jewish scriptures. And so Ptolemy sent a letter to the high priest, whose name is Eleazar, in Jerusalem, and said, I would like to have you send scholars and translators down to Egypt and translate your scriptures into my language, Greek. And so the high priest of Jerusalem in Jerusalem agreed, and he sent 72 scholars from Jerusalem down to Alexandria, Egypt, and that is where they initially translated the Septuagint in the year 250 BC.
Before we continue, I've been personally funding the Finding Genius podcast for 4.5 years now, which has led to 2,700 plus interviews of clinicians, researchers, scientists, CEOs, and other amazing people who are working to advance science and improve our lives and our world. Even though this podcast gets 100,000 plus downloads a month, we need your help to reach hundreds of thousands more worldwide. Please visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click on Support Us. We have 3 levels of membership from $10 to $49 a month, including perks such as the ability to see ahead in our interview calendar and ask questions of upcoming guests, transcripts of podcasts you're interested in, the ability to request specific topics or guests, and more. Visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click Support Us today. Now back to the show.
Is that why they call it the Septuagint, because of the 72 people involved?
Yes. Let me tell you about the name, because when it was first translated, it was translated by 72 scholars. But for simplicity's sake, the name of the translation was called the Translation of the 70. So for simplicity, I think they shortened it down to 70, and that's what its name was, the Translation of the 70. That was its name for 600 years. The word Septuagint comes from the Latin, and the Christian named Augustine, who lived around 350, he's the one who coined the term Septuagint, which is 70 in Latin. And I'm glad he did. Even though Septuagint is a big word, maybe it's hard to pronounce, but it is easier to say than Translation of the 70. So
this was what, in the year 300?
Augustine lived in the year around 350 AD, and the Septuagint started in 250 BC. But one of the things about the Septuagint is its incredible popularity. Because the Septuagint was translated by Jewish translators and scholars, and because it was in a common language, and quickly back to Alexander the Great, after Alexander the Great conquered and died, the Greek language was what they call the universal language of the Mediterranean. And you're familiar with universal language, right?
No, what do you mean universal language? I know like Esperanto was made to be a common language that didn't work out, but what do you mean a universal language?
Universal language means it was the language that everything translated into and out of. So Koine Greek was so common and so universal that all languages translated into it and then back out of it. So
it's like Koine Greek was like the Bitcoin of language 2,000 years ago.
Yeah. So like if you wanted to go from Latin to Arabic, you could go straight there, maybe if someone knew both languages, but pretty much everybody just put their languages into Greek and then translated it back out of Greek. So that's why the Septuagint was so huge, because Koine Greek was a language that most everybody was familiar with. And if anybody in the whole Mediterranean world knew 2 languages, one of those languages would have been Koine Greek. So that's why the Septuagint became very, very, very popular, because it was the Old Testament in the common language.
Okay, so it was commissioned. What about the New Testament, though? I mean, that was already in Greek. Do you think the New Testament influenced Ptolemy II to say, what about the old part? Let's get it in here, too, and make it cohesive?
Well, the Ptolemy dynasty pretty much died off right before Jesus came. You may have heard of Cleopatra. She was one of the final queens of the Ptolemy dynasty. Like, she was Greek queen of Egypt. And so she I think she lived and died right before Jesus. When the New Testament was written in Greek, the apostles did that because it was the common language. And that's why New Testament's in Greek, because it was very much common by then. So yeah.
Okay. Who wrote about this? Like, did they, at that time, I guess they were still on papyrus scrolls, the Old Testament. And where would they have gotten it from, and how would they have vetted it? Like, any old synagogue was good, or like, where do you think they got the source material scrolls to copy from?
I'm not sure. Are you talking about like the paper materials?
Yeah, the actual physical materials that the scribes, the 70 or 72, would sit down and copy. Where do you think is there anything written about where they literally got the scrolls from? Was there a particular church or?
No, I think they were supplied by King Ptolemy II, that when he commissioned them to translate it, he gave them all the supplies they need. And then from there, copies were made. And I can't really speak to to the paper or whatever, but I do know that if you were a king in that time, you had no shortage of paper. Like if the king wanted paper, he could get it. The common person, I'm not sure how hard it was to get paper back then.
Do you know if it was still papyrus or was it, was it a different form, like animal hides? I guess they would have gotten it from a Jewish, synagogue and opened the scrolls and started copying there,
That's a good question. I don't know exactly what the material was. I know it was some kind of paper, like it could be from papyrus or something. They were definitely beyond writing on animal skins. But I will say that the Old Testament scriptures in Hebrew that were in Jerusalem, again, this is not Septuagint or Egypt, this is in Jerusalem. They had the scriptures written on stone and gold in Jerusalem. And so in Jerusalem, they had the highest form of written scriptures because, stone and gold. But,
well, in Egypt, too, they would have been a ready supply of papyrus. So, yeah, that makes sense that's where things would have happened,
Yeah.
It makes sense.
And it makes sense that Ptolemy would want to make his Library of Alexandria there because, again, paper, papyrus paper, they probably supplied paper to the rest of the world in a way. Yeah, maybe. One of the things I want to share is where do we learn about the origin of the Septuagint? And amazingly, there actually is a primary source. And like you and I have talked in our last episode, one of the things I do as a historian is I go to the oldest historical record of something to find out what's genuine. And when you have a primary source, that means a first-hand witness. It's a huge piece of evidence. And the origins of the Septuagint are written in this document called the Letter of Aristeas. Aristeas was an Egyptian Jew, and according to his letter, he went to King Ptolemy and said, hey, there's scriptures up in Jerusalem. You could add that to your library. And then that prompted Ptolemy to write to the high priest and get this done. And then in the rest of Aristeas' letter, he records in great detail his journey. He goes to Jerusalem and he has great detail of what the temple looked like in 250 BC. And he goes and visits with the high priest. Then he comes back and speaks to how the Septuagint was translated, by the 72 scholars. And his writing is extremely detailed, and I was amazed by it because it's a primary source. Aristeas.
So he witnessed the transcribing.
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. And so Aristeas is a primary source. Now, typically, as a historian, you definitely need corroborating sources. So for that, you usually go to other primary sources or you go to secondary sources. So I like to share some secondary sources of other ancient people who said, yes, this is how it happened. And one is Philo of Alexandria. Philo of Alexandria was a very famous Jew who lived in Alexandria, and he lived in the early ADs. Like, he probably died right after Jesus died. He lived in Rome right while Jesus was living in Judea. And so Philo wrote a lot about the Septuagint, and he praised it. He said, here is the Septuagint. Yes, it was translated here, and Aristeas has a true account of how this happened. So Philo, again, early 1st century AD, he writes about it. And then the very famous Josephus, who lived in the late 1st century AD, after Jesus. Josephus wrote about the Septuagint and said, this is what we use. This is our Old Testament. And Josephus also repeats from the letter of Aristeas saying, yep, this is how it happened.
What stage would the Septuagint have been in at the time of Jesus' ministry?
Okay, so the Septuagint, when it was first translated in 250 by the 72 scholars, all they translated was the books of Moses, the Pentateuch. And so they did the first 5 books of the Bible. And it was over the next 300 years after that the rest of the Old Testament was translated and added to the Septuagint.
It was started under Ptolemy II, and then it would have been, I don't know how many kings after that were leaders, like 5, 6, 10.
Mm-hmm.
It's a long period of time.
Now, I think after Ptolemy, I don't think the following kings commissioned anything. I think Ptolemy II started the Septuagint, it was established, and I think the Jews took it from there, where the Jews said, all right, let's translate more books into Greek and put it in the Septuagint so that more people around the world can read it.
And so it's like saying, we want to get the rest of the catalog on Spotify and YouTube and make sure it's as widely distributed as possible.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay.
All right, so what I want to explain next is where they translated it in Alexandria, because this is one of the coolest pieces of information I found. Okay, so in Aristeas' letter, he says that the scholars came to Alexandria, and Ptolemy said, all right, I have a place for you to translate. And so he leads them along this seawall out into the Mediterranean to a little island. And the seawall is 7 stadia long, and he leads them out to the island called Pharos. There's an island right there called Pharos. And Ptolemy leads the scholars to the secluded house on the far side of the island. And so me being a historian, I'm thinking, I want to locate this. I want to find where this is. So I do some Googling, which it didn't take long for me to find, but I found that this seawall was built by Ptolemy's dad, who was Ptolemy the First. Ptolemy the First built the seawall, and he called it the Heptastadion. And
meaning like 7 something?
yes, actually, it means 7 stadia. Yeah.
Okay.
And so he built that. And so putting that together, that's what the scholars were walking across to get to this island. So what I did is I went to a map and I found the island of Pharos, and I see the bridge, the seawall that goes out to the island. Then if you're on this island and you go out to the edge of the island to this so-called secluded house on the far side, on this island, there's something there. Like in Aristeas, he doesn't call it this. Aristeas does not identify this house. But when you're looking at a map and you see what's there, there is something there. And what is there? This house that the scholars went to is the Lighthouse of Alexandria. This is one of the 7 wonders of the world. And I guess it didn't have that name or anything when Aristeas lived, but the lighthouse would have been constructed around this time because it was the Greeks who constructed the lighthouse. And so here you have these scholars translating the Old Testament from Hebrew to Greek at the Lighthouse of Alexandria. And when I discovered that, I was blown away. I just really love it when history comes together and you hear something that is connected to something else. It's very exciting.
They would have written this in the lighthouse. So what else did you find out about the lighthouse? Is it open today? Is it a tourist place? Like, what is the condition of it nowadays?
Okay. The condition of the Lighthouse of Alexandria today is, I'm not exactly sure because I looked it up recently and it's controlled by I'm not sure where the state of the lighthouse is today. I don't think it's a big tourist spot, which I wish it was because one of the...
You could travel there.
I think you can, but it's not friendly to Americans, per se, from what I understand. But I think you still can, maybe if you're a part of a tour or something like that. But that's one place I would love to visit sometime.
That's what I mean. Why not contact the Egyptian government or tourism and see if it can be visited?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Maybe you call a local tour company and say, hey, I'm interested in this, the island of Pharos, can we go there? It might be really cool. I would guess it's largely ignored. I haven't really heard anyone talk about this, so that would be my guess. So maybe it's actually an opportune place to go to.
Right. As with a lot of the wonders of the world, I don't know what year it happened, but several earthquakes did destroy the lighthouse itself. The lighthouse is destroyed, but the base structure, like ground level structures, are still there. And when I looked at it recently, it's called a fort today. I don't think it's a military fort because I did look at some pictures. It looks beautiful. It does look like it could be a tourist attraction still, but they call it a fort and it looks very beautiful. But unfortunately, again, the lighthouse has been destroyed because of earthquakes.
What else was written about the lighthouse itself? Did they say much about it? Or they just said a house at the end and nothing else was said?
I'm blown away by that too, because you're right. Aristeas just calls it a secluded house.
Well, maybe it was a house and then it was made into a lighthouse later on.
Right. Well, I looked at the dates that when the Ptolemies built the lighthouse, and it looks like construction started a couple decades before Aristeas, and construction was completed sometime soon after Aristeas. So it was either under construction or it was completed, I think, by the time the Septuagint was written. So,
well, back in the day, they probably would have had someone that lived there. So maybe that's why they called it a house. Like there might have been a caretaker. I'm just making this up. I have no idea.
True. Though I will say that it's a very large lighthouse, very large, where 72 scholars could have their own rooms in this place to translate. And which brings me to the legend of the translation that I like to share. Is a legend behind the translation, that the translation happened miraculously. And so what I'd like to share with you is what Irenaeus said about this legend. Irenaeus was a Christian who lived in the year 180. And so he's writing about this thing that happened in 250 BC. And I'll actually read what Irenaeus wrote. He says, wishing to test the translators individually, fearing that they might take counsel together and conceal the truth in the scriptures in their own interpretations, Ptolemy separated them from each other and commanded them all to write the same translation. He did this with respect to all 5 of the books. When they came together in the same place before Ptolemy, each of them compared his own interpretation with that of another. God was indeed glorified, and the scriptures were acknowledged as truly divine, for all of them read out loud the common translation in the very same words and the very same names from the beginning to the end, so that even the Gentiles present perceived that the scriptures had been interpreted by the inspiration of God.
That's pretty cool. Wow.
Yes. And so when I heard this, now I'm a skeptic at heart, I think. So I have my doubts. So I did look into this and think, how true is this legend? And again, as a historian, you got to go to the corroborating sources and evidences and see who else had things to say about this. And so the earliest evidence of this legend that we have comes from Philo of Alexandria. Again, he's a Jew that would have lived in the early 1st century. Same time as Jesus. And Philo said that this legend is true. Another place you find this legend is in the Babylonian Talmud. That is a set of the Jewish traditions and teachings that were compiled around the 300s and 400s AD. But it speaks to this legend. Also, among the Christians, you have Irenaeus, who I read from, and you also have Justin Martyr, who also said this happened. And so Justin repeats the legend and he says, and this is true, we don't narrate fiction. So Justin was without doubt that this legend is true.
Okay.
Then I looked deeper, and then you got to go back to the primary source, which is Aristeas. Again, he wrote how it got translated. He was there. And Aristeas does not mention this legend at all. And you think he would be the one who mentions it because he was there. And what Aristeas says is that when they translated, they had it read aloud to Demetrius, who was, I guess, the king's attendant. Then they had the translation read aloud to the king, King Ptolemy. And but there's no mention of this legend or miracle. Josephus wrote a lot about the Septuagint, but Josephus never mentions this legend.
What are your thoughts then?
So the question is, so is the legend true or not? And I don't know.
Who was the person that you said, what was his name?
Aristeas?
No, not Aristeas, the one that said it is true. The 2 people that said, one that said what happened and the other one that corroborated.
Okay, so Philo is the first evidence of it. The Jew that lived in Alexandria, 300 years after the Septuagint. Babylonian Talmud mentions it. And then among the Christians, Justin Martyr and Irenaeus mention it.
All right, but Justin Martyr is the only one that corroborates supposedly that all the different scribes said the exact same words.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, all 4 of those people I mentioned, they say, yes, this legend is true. They all miraculously got a translation.
But what if you have those? All right, so if you put these accounts chronologically, which one would be the earliest?
Okay. Oh, yeah, great question. So Aristeas would be the earliest primary source. He was there. He does not mention it. Then you have Philo, Philo of Alexandria, the early 1st century. He mentions it. Then you have Josephus, late 1st century. He does not mention it. And then from the Talmud, which is the Jewish traditions and teachings, it does mention it. And then later the 2 Christians mention it too. So that's the chronological order.
It's almost like the Gospels in a way. The accounts are similar but different.
Yes. Yeah.
What other analyses have you done, like more an in-depth analysis of all these corroborating sources and see like what's similar, what's different, in addition to, besides this one major,
Right. To me, I've done as much research as I can. I mean, I've looked into as many ancient sources as I could. And so as a historian, what are we left with? We're left with kind of you can accept it or not, because again, primary source doesn't mention it, but then a lot of the Jewish and Christian traditions do mention it. So which one is correct? It's hard to tell. And so really we just have to come to the conclusion of, hey, here's the evidence, make up your own mind. For me, that's hard because I really want to find the truth, but we just have to deal with the evidence we have.
Were any of these 72 named? Does anyone know any of them?
Oh, that's a great question. Okay, so in the letter of Aristeas, which is a very lengthy letter, it's over 300 verses. I don't remember if each of them are named. It could be. But in the letter of Aristeas, which is fascinating, when they arrive in Egypt to translate, they have a dinner with King Ptolemy II. And Ptolemy asks each of them a question that relates to philosophy or wisdom. Like, what do you guys think about this piece of wisdom? And he asks every scholar a different question, and they all have an answer. And so if they had names, it was there. I don't remember if they had names or not.
All right, so so there's no mention of any of their names.
Mm-hmm.
for each book, how many individual scholars or how many individual transcribers would have transcribed it? So how many versions were there to compare and see they were all exactly the same?
Sure. Well, in the first 5 books of Moses, you had the 72, and they all translated each of them translated all 5 books individually, and they brought them together. Actually, what Aristeas said, Aristeas does give a different account. Again, he was there. He says that when all the translators brought their versions together, Demetrius, who was the attendant to the king, brought them together and then compared them and said, all right, here is the common denominator. This is what we're going to go with, which is normally how history works or how translations work. Like even when we are trying to reconstruct the Iliad, we look at the ancient documents and they don't agree all the time. And so historians and scholars look at them and say, okay, we can see that some of these documents are different than most of them. So my answer is that the scholars did, according to Aristeas, the scholars got together and said, all right, here's what we all think, but here's what we're going to go with.
All right, so the fact that they matched was just because they did corroborate beforehand.
That's 2 different stories, you know. One's the miraculous story and one is the Aristeas' version. But in the end, they did have one solidified version. Now, this is one thing I want to point out. The only thing that I gain from the story of the legend, the miraculous legend, the thing I gain is that legend came from somewhere. And I really think it came about because the Septuagint was so popular. People praised and used and spread the Septuagint all over, and it was so well respected. I can see how that legend could come about because it was just so well respected.
But also, too, the scribes themselves, like you said, got together and said, all right, we're going to make sure. So I can see where the legend came from in that regard, that maybe some of the sources did not know that the scribes worked together, so therefore it appeared miraculous. Maybe the scribes, in corroboration with their patron, said, yeah, we got together and all the other stuff, but we're not going to say anything. We're just going to present this as if it is a miraculous thing to support its veracity,
I think what you just said there makes the most sense. I think that is probably the best explanation, is that they all worked together and then people looking back didn't realize some details and said, you know what, God must have done that.
They could be.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So how many different scribes do you think did each book? Did they divide the 70 up into like groups of 10, like 7 groups of 10 or something, or who knows?
I think each scholar did all 5 books themselves. And so they had 72 versions to compare. That's what I get from it. That they didn't you take Genesis, you take Exodus. I think they all did it.
I would think maybe they'd have like teams where they have like a main and then helpers. And then maybe the main would, okay, I'm responsible for Genesis, and you 6 are going to be writing, and I'm going to be the one that's checking everything and make sure it's all together. And like managing you guys essentially.
No, what you're saying makes sense because that's how we would project manager things today. But back then, I think it was one of those things where you're doing this for the king. And so the king can waste money on whatever he wants to waste money on. Plus, on the Jewish side, I think they would say, we want 72 different eyes to look at this so we can have 72 different votes, quote unquote, on what's the right way to translate this. So when you have 72 people translating something and they all come together and say, all right, let's discuss what we've done, then I think you've got a fantastically, they weren't very efficient in their use of time, but I think they were efficient in their use of, let's make sure we get this right. I think that's my answer to that.
So, all right, if you had 5 different groups, or if you had 72 different ones, what happened to 71 out of the 72 efforts? Were they all thrown away? Where would they have gone to? Like, and whose was picked and why? And then wouldn't that create, upset? Like if you and I were 2 of the scribes and, your book of Genesis was accepted and mine wasn't, I'd be like, hey, man, come on, I did all this work. It's not fair. I don't know. It's just weird. It's very strange how this what would have happened to all this. They wouldn't have just thrown it away.
There's probably a couple scholars that, did things differently, like you said, translated it differently. But I think they were all there for the same purpose and they all worked as a team. So I think they worked through their things. When I read the letter of Aristeas, I just saw this amazing purpose and enthusiasm in everybody involved, that they all knew what they were there to do, and they were all there to accomplish the task, not to be there to argue amongst themselves, but they probably did too, but that's not the purpose.
Yeah, and they would have had to make copies. So maybe all of them were accepted, but which one of them would have been the main one? Like Ptolemy would have said, all right, do this, and we want X number of copies to distribute to like his favored churches or whatever, but he would have wanted, obviously, the best one for himself, maybe to keep and display or to put
in the library.
in the library. But he would have wanted some for himself, I'm sure, like extra copies and stuff to have on hand. Can't imagine not.
Yeah. Well, or just the library was his copy. Yeah.
Or to say to him, like, in honor of your great patronage, oh, Ptolemy, here's a beautiful gold leaf version for you and for the wife and for the for the kids. And I don't know. It's just, I wonder how it would have been disseminated again. How many copies would have been kept?
Right.
What would have happened to them?
And that's a great question. I'm not sure. I do know that, the main copy that they had in the library, it was available in the library for anyone. So if any Jew from anywhere in the Mediterranean world, if they came to Alexandria, they could go into the library, access the Septuagint, and just translate it for themselves. I mean, copy it for themselves. And I just think that is fantastic that, it was publicly available.
Yeah.
One of the things I want to mention is when the Septuagint, I said the Septuagint began just with the books of Moses, the first 5 books. Over the next 250, 300 years, other Jews came and translated other books. For example, someone would have come later and translated Isaiah or Jeremiah or the Psalms and all these things. And so over the time, people came and translated the other books of the Old Testament. Now, one of the interesting things I want to point out, this is very fascinating, is some of the books in the Septuagint are what we call the Deuterocanon. The Deuterocanon are books that the Protestants do not have in their Bibles, but the Catholics and Orthodox do. And the Deuterocanon were about 11 or 13 books that were added to the Septuagint along with the others, along with Daniel and Esther and all these ones. The Deuterocanon, when they were translated, you have some translators' notes added to them. Like the Jew that translated it, they actually put some of their own notes in there. I want to share a couple of examples from that. I'll give you a couple examples of the Deuterocanon. A few of the books would include the Maccabees. And, of course, the books in the Maccabees explain the origin of Hanukkah.
Okay.
You've got a book called The Wisdom of Solomon, or just Wisdom. You have a book called Sirach. Sirach is an interesting one. It was translated by a certain Jew, and he said, this book was written by my grandfather, who was a leading Jew in Jerusalem. And Sirach is a long book that probably reads more like the Proverbs, but Sirach has a lot of teachings that Jesus adopted. Or Jesus repeated. Actually, there's a few things from the Sermon on the Mount that were previously mentioned in Sirach. So It's very fascinating. And again, with the Sirach, in those translators' notes, he actually says the date he translated it. So me as a historian, I'm thinking, oh, that's so helpful. Thank you. Because it puts it in the frame of history for me. So Sirach would have been written, if I remember, about 90 BC. Or it was written about 150 BC, but translated in 90 BC. And it was added to the Septuagint. And the Catholics, the Orthodox, they all see Sirach as scripture. And I've read through Sirach, and I think it's fantastic, but that's another example. The one translator's notes that I think is very fascinating is with Job. Whoever translated Job from Hebrew into the Greek put some notes at the end, and they tell us who Job was.
Really?
So what they said is, at the very end of Job, translators' notes that say that Job is the 5th generation from Abraham through Esau. So Job was an Edomite, because Edom is through Esau. And Job was a righteous man. I guess, see here, Abraham, Isaac, Esau, 3. So I guess 2 more generations after Esau, if my math is right, is when Job lived. And so if Job is 5 generations after Abraham, you can think about it this way. Moses is 6 generations after Abraham. So Job and Moses may have been contemporaries. And when I read that in these translators' notes, it really brings out a lot. And I just think that really helps me understand who Job was. And if you look at the chronology, in fact, I'll bring in Genesis to this. If you look in Genesis chapter 36, verse 33, there's a man there called Jobab. And that person would have lived at the exact same time as this translator is saying, and that I believe the translator's note says, yes, that is Job. So for me, I'd love reading translators' notes like this because it gives me a time frame of when Job lived.
How often do they do translators' notes? I mean, I've never heard of such a thing.
It's not often. I would say there's translators' notes at the end of Job, but that's all I can remember as far as the books of the Old Testament that everybody accepts. But again, with the Deuterocanon, I would say there are translators' notes on maybe 25% of the books. There's a note about where.
Why so much? Because they knew they had to go to a higher level of proof than what was considered canon?
Maybe so. I think it's just scholarly reasons. If you're a good scholar, you're going to say, here's my preface, or here's my citations. I think they were doing that as good translators and good scholars. They're saying, here's more information and here's why you can trust it, or here's how you can get more information.
Okay.
I just love it for those reasons.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. Why would Job's name be Jobab? Is that a common change of it? Andrew saying Andy for short? Is that what it's about?
Yeah. I think that's a very good analogy. Yeah. There's a lot of people in the scriptures that went by multiple names, and it was just different forms and the same name, really. Yeah.
Like if your name was Carlos, you'd be like Carlito, your mom called you that or something.
Right.
Okay. Interesting.
So the last thing I want to mention is what happened to the Septuagint.
Okay.
Because it fell out of popularity. So with Christianity, the Christians, both the apostles and the early Christians, they pointed to the Septuagint and said, hey, look at all these prophecies of Jesus. And the Septuagint was celebrated by the Jews and the Christians. But once the Christians started becoming a big religion, the Jews said, oh boy, they're using the Septuagint to prove Jesus. And when the Christians started saying the Septuagint is ours, well, the Christians said the Septuagint's everybody's. But when the Christians started using it, a lot of Jews said, ooh, this is not good for us, and we don't like that. So around the year 100 AD, or after, the Jews commissioned more people to retranslate the Old Testament into different Greek versions. For example, there was one version of the Greek Old Testament by Theodotion. There's one version by Aquila of Sinope, and there's another version by Semachus. And what I see in this history is the Jews started to disrespect and disuse the Septuagint. And they commissioned these other people to come up with their versions of the Septuagint that coincidentally have a lot fewer prophecies about Jesus.
Really? Oh, wow. They're radically different then.
Yeah. Now, are they...
So that fits with the incentive to totally change it. Wow.
No, are they purposely going in and changing all these prophecies intentionally? Okay, I'm not going to judge their motives, but that's what it seems like if you look at the connections here.
Today, I don't know if you heard, but the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, has their own Bible now because Christianity is exploding in China. So they made their own Bible where Jesus is evil stuff. They're passing out tons of them and stuff, and so they're trying to change people's perception because if you can't beat them, don't join them, but change the narrative. So it seems like this is exactly the same thing from thousands of years before.
Now there's this one. It's another legend. There's this idea that the Jews called a council to get this done, and it's called the Council of Jamnia. There's information that there's a Council of Jamnia that happened in the year 90, and it was there the Jews said, we will abandon the Septuagint, we will go to different translations, and we need to really take a lot of Jesus out of the Old Testament. And so I looked into this. I thought, okay, this would be a smoking gun, right? If you could find a Council of Jamnia where they said, we're doing this. So I looked into it, and to my surprise, there is zero evidence that there ever was a Council of Jamnia. Again, this is another legend that someone came up with that said, I see the Jews abandoning the Septuagint, coincidentally, after Christianity got popular. So they must have had a council to get this done. But unfortunately, in reality, there is no evidence that there was a Council of Jamnia.
So were these just all individual synagogues that said we're going to take matters into our own hands? Like what kind of Jews were these three, other scholars? Were there different kinds back then? Or?
Theodotion, he was not a Jew by birth. He was a proselyte, so he converted to Judaism. If I remember, Aquila wasn't even Jewish at all. And Semachus, we know the least about him. I don't remember. I think I'm correct about that. Theodotion was definitely a proselyte. Aquila, I don't think that the person was even a Jew. So there's some sketchy things like that. So
just to go back for a moment, when was the Septuagint completed then? Started in 50 BC?
It was completed. It was completed either before Jesus or right after Jesus. Now,
when you say before Jesus, you mean right before his ministry, or before he was born, or many years before he was born?
Before his ministry. I think they had the scriptures part of the Septuagint done by the time Jesus came, but they added a couple other books to the Septuagint that no one considers scripture. Those two are 4th Maccabees and another work called the Psalms of Solomon. These were added to the Septuagint later, but the Jews nor Christians or anyone considered that scripture. So those are definitely Apocrypha, not Deuterocanon. But I guess when I say they were added to the Septuagint, it's because when we find manuscripts of the Septuagint and we recover and discover them, we find, not all the time, sometimes we find those two books in there too.
Well, what was the oldest Septuagint? It's not the original, but What is the oldest Septuagint ever found, and where did it come from?
That's a great question. Wikipedia has an answer to that about what is the oldest complete Septuagint we have. But I will say that we have found fragments of the Septuagint from the 100s BC, fragments that date back to then. So we do have fragments that the Septuagint did exist before Jesus. Absolutely. We have fragments from the BC time period. So yeah.
Has any scholars taken the Dead Sea Scroll versions and compare that to the Septuagint, the earliest, fragments found?
Yes. I'm glad you brought up Dead Sea Scrolls because they are a huge witness here. So like what you and I talked about in our last episode was the Masoretic Hebrew. We date that back to about 900 AD. That family, that's as far back as we can go in history with that. I know it did exist before, but that's as far as historians can go back to find evidence. The Septuagint, we have evidence of it going back to 250 BC, like what you and I have been talking today. The Dead Sea Scrolls are fantastic because they were written in the 1st century, and then they were preserved, and we found them in the 1900s. And that is mind-blowing that we found complete manuscripts that date back 1900 years. Dead Sea Scrolls are a giant witness to all of this. Now, what the Dead Sea Scrolls show is very interesting, that they show that during the 1st century, when Jesus lived and such, the Dead Sea Scrolls show that there was a Hebrew family of manuscripts back there that people used. That Hebrew did exist. I mean, we all knew it did, but it proves that it did. We just don't have the history of what it looked like back then. Then the Dead Sea Scrolls also proved that there was a Septuagint family of manuscripts because the Dead Sea Scrolls had some books that followed the Septuagint readings. Let me give you one example. The most famous manuscript from the Dead Sea Scrolls is the complete scroll of Isaiah. And that is on display in a museum in Jerusalem. And I almost got to visit that a few years ago. And that scroll, when you compare that scroll of Isaiah to either to today's Septuagint or today's Masoretic, that scroll actually matches today's Masoretic. So that scroll of Isaiah proves that the Hebrew does go back that far. It did exist, and it was there in the 1st century. But again, there were other books in the Dead Sea Scrolls that read way more like the Septuagint. So the Dead Sea Scrolls just kind of showed that there was a lot of manuscript variations back then.
Yeah, no, that's amazing.
Yes, it is.
Have you studied Koine Greek to be able to read it natively?
I wished. I have some tools that I've used where I can, like I say, I can know enough to be dangerous.
What were the original works of all these corroborating, I'm sorry about the names, but the primary source for the Septuagint and all the other sources, were they all written in Koine Greek, or what language are they written in?
Yes, let's see here. Philo, I will say that, yes, they were all written in Greek. Philo, Josephus, Aristeas, Irenaeus, Justin Martyr, they all wrote in Greek. There's one more Christian that wrote about the Septuagint, and his name is Tertullian, and he wrote in Latin. But pretty much all corroborating evidence is also in Greek. Yeah.
Interesting. I wonder if you go to Egypt today, if there's much evidence of the Koine Greek still around and used in who knows where.
I don't think so. I think Koine Greek has naturally evolved over the last 2,000 years into modern Greek, because classical Greek is definitely...
It was in Egypt. When did it leave, and what marks did it leave, if any? I know it's a huge question. When did Arabic take over, and when did, ancient Egyptian go away? I mean, when, what happened to the languages? When did it leave Egypt, essentially?
Well, when the Ptolemy dynasty ended, again, right before Jesus, around the time Cleopatra and such, I don't know of Egypt's history much after that, but you're right. The Arabs took it over one time, and then another time the Egyptians reclaimed their government at another time. I don't know the years on all that, though.
I've heard that in Egypt today, there's still Coptic Christians, they're called.
Yes, Coptic is just another word. To me, Coptic just means Egyptian Christians, because there's Coptic Catholicism, there's Coptic Orthodox, and Coptic Christians. So Coptic really just kind of means kind of Egyptian culture.
I have homework for you. You need to learn Koine Greek in full, and you need to travel to Egypt, and especially to the island of Pharos and all these other places, and talk to some of the Coptic Christians from the old churches and see what you can trace back to find out more.
I would love that. That sounds fun.
It would be cool if on your channel, and I know we're taking this aside, but on your channel, if you were to do a fundraiser where that would be your goal, is your community supports you to go out and helps pay for you to go do this and then report back to them, it might be something that could work.
That'd be a dream. Yep.
Yeah.
Back to what happened to the Septuagint. This is the last point I had, is that's when the Jews stopped using the Septuagint, was right after Jesus. And the question is, when did Christians stop using the Septuagint? So like I said, the early Christians the Christianity for the first 300 years used the Septuagint, and they said, this is our Old Testament. You Jews made this. You guys disproved it. I don't know why you abandoned it, but we're still using your scriptures. Okay, so the church used the Septuagint until the time of Jerome. Jerome lived in the late 300s, and the church in Rome commissioned Jerome to translate the scriptures into Latin. There were translations before that into Latin, but the church wanted an official Latin version. They commissioned Jerome to do it. Jerome was the very first Christian ever who said, I'm not going to get the Old Testament from the Septuagint. I'm going to go to Jerusalem, and I'm going to get the Old Testament from the Jews. So Jerome went to Bethlehem and translated the Old Testament into Latin there. And I actually visited the cave. It was like a house cave there where he translated it. I had to visit that one time. And so Jerome translated the Vulgate. Again, he did the Latin Vulgate, and he took it from the Hebrew, not the Greek. Now, of course, Jerome's New Testament would come from the Greek Gospels and letters. But Jerome was the first to break tradition with that. And that's what the Catholic Church had used all the centuries after Jerome. They said, the Latin Vulgate is our scriptures. And then you've got the Orthodox churches. All the Orthodox churches, they actually stuck with the Septuagint. And even today, they said the Septuagint has always been our Old Testament from the very beginning. So the Orthodox Church, they use Septuagint as their Old Testament. Now, what about the Protestants? So the Protestants come on the scene in the 1500s, Martin Luther being one of the first big reformers. And he says, I need to translate the scriptures into German, which is such a fantastic idea. Luther does the same thing Jerome did. Instead of going to the Latin with the Catholic Church or the Greek with the Orthodox Church, Luther says, I'm going to go to the Jews and get the Hebrew. And so Luther did that, and he translated the Old Testament into German. The rest of the reformers just kind of followed his lead, like Tyndale and others. You know, Tyndale being one of the earliest that translated into English. They went to the Jews for their Old Testament and got it from the Jewish Hebrew. So today, every English Bible, the Old Testament comes from the Hebrew because that's what the reformers did. And so that's how the Septuagint fell out of use in Christianity, except for the Orthodox Church. But like I said, when I made my Septuagint videos on my channel, I find that a lot of people are very interested about this subject and curious about the Septuagint. And I think you should be curious about the Septuagint because it's the original version of the Old Testament that the apostles and the early Christians used.
Very, very interesting.
Well, yeah, thanks for letting me tell you that story. To me, I was very enlightened learning about how things came to be and how they fell out of favor or whatever. And I love history.
Yeah, no, it's really fascinating. Just as the last item, so, I'm sure there's far, far, far more on your channel on YouTube, Post-Apostolic Church. Are there any current projects that you want to tell listeners about so they can, start listening to your videos and follow you and get excited about what's your next area of study here and research?
So if you visit my YouTube channel, I do have 4 foundational videos that discuss a lot of what I've talked about today. And I highly recommend seeing those if you want more information. But I've decided to make that series continue on. One of the things that is interesting is when the New Testament quotes from the Old Testament, does the New Testament take from the Greek Septuagint? Does the New Testament take from the Hebrew? And more often than not, again, New Testament scripture takes from the Septuagint. So what I've done is I've continued that video series, and what I'm doing is I'm going through the entire New Testament and looking at every time the Old Testament is quoted and looking at, did they take it from the Greek or from the Hebrew?
You should be able to tell.
Well, it's very simple. You take what the New Testament writer said. So they've said what they've said. Then you compare that to how it reads in the Septuagint and how it reads in the Hebrew.
I see what you mean.
Because there's some passages that you read in the New Testament, and if you follow the cross-reference back to the Old Testament, it reads differently. And you're like, wow, why is that? It's because it's different in the Hebrew or the Hebrew or the Septuagint. And so what I'm doing in that video series is I'm counting them and seeing how the New Testament, how those two languages differ. Because me as a Christian, when I read the New Testament, I see them quoting the Old Testament the way it should be quoted. Like if I believe the apostles are inspired, I think what the New Testament says is what's accurate. So if I'm going to go back, I'm going to say, all right, was the Septuagint more accurate here then because it reads the same, or was the Hebrew more accurate because it reads the same? So that's how I'm comparing them.
In services online like Bible Gateway and things like that, they don't seem to have, they have the NIV, they have the New Living Translation, the King James, but I don't know if any of them have like the Septuagint or the Masoretic, version of the Old Testament. It would be interesting if they have that,
Oh, you bring up a good point, because where are we going to find a copy of the Septuagint in English for us? And there's 3 I'd like to recommend. 2 of them are free. The first place you can get the Septuagint is a translation called Brenton's. Brenton was an Englishman who translated the Septuagint into English in the 1800s. And because it's old, it's free, and you can find it online in probably many, many places. But because it was translated in the 1800s, it's kind of hard to understand at times. Another one is called the Nets, Nets. And that is a scholarly translation of the Septuagint in English. And currently, if you go to their website, it's free. It's called the New English Translation of the Septuagint, Nets. And there's PDFs there you can download. And they've even translated the Psalms of Solomon. Again, Psalms of Solomon, not scripture, according to anyone, but they did translate it, which is very impressive. The third way to get the Septuagint is not free. It's the Orthodox Study Bible. 2008, the Orthodox Church translated it into English and printed it. And I think that's the only way you can get it, is a printed copy. And it's called the Orthodox Study Bible. The Old Testament is Septuagint into English. And then the New Testament is just the New King James Version. And that's another...
This would be for you. I just looked. So at University of Pennsylvania, that's where Nets is. They have the translator in each book. I mean, again, Salam, I know I'm giving you a lot of work here. You could contact Nets and speak to some of these translators, and by definition, they would be fluent in Koine Greek. And if you talk to them about any questions you have, they may be able to get you a little bit closer on some issues. All these people, by definition, they had to know it to do it, There's like 30 different names here, at least 50 different names.
I try to tackle this as a historian from that angle. But you're right. Those translators are tackling it from a language perspective, which is very, very important.
Not only that, imagine if you spoke to, I know it'd be hard, but if you spoke to every single one of them and you asked them as many questions as they could, like what history do they know? What sources might they know that you don't know? You may get a few extra ones that you could look into to go even deeper.
Yes, absolutely. Yep.
Because these people would have had to be they're not just going to learn the language with no context, so they have to have a lot more context in order to, again, to know Koine Greek. So they may be able to lead you, it's like living historical research. They may be able to lead you closer to what you want.
I would imagine they'd be so good at it that to them, Koine Greek would be more than just, I know how to conjugate. To them, they would know the idioms and the nuances quite deeply, I bet. Yeah.
So anyway, very, very cool. I love talking to you about this stuff. It's really, really interesting. And it's nice to see that, again, you have a personal interest. You're not speaking in, like professorial gobbledygook. It's in accessible language and everything. And I think it's been great. And I just want to thank you for coming again. And, I encourage listeners to definitely go to your channel on YouTube, because, I mean, this is just like a tiny sample of what you've read and learned and researched. And there's so much more out there that I think you're a fantastic resource for people. So I appreciate and thank you for what you do.
I appreciate that. Thank you. And I also thank you for allowing me to share my passions for history and scripture.
Excellent.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.